Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a story where a family's love is tested by hidden agendas and power struggles. What happens when one family member's choices threaten to break everything apart? Stay tuned to find out how the CEO's life takes a dramatic turn. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The family meeting was calm, too calm. For a moment, it felt like everything was normal again. But the weight of the unspoken tension hung thick in the air, like a fog that wouldn't lift. The CEO sat at the dining table, opposite his parents. His father, calm as always, never let anything ruffle his composure. His mother, on the other hand, held an air of controlled restraint. She wasn't angry, not yet, but the disappointment in her eyes was clear. This wasn't just about family matters, it was about control. His father was the first to speak, his tone firm but not unkind. "We've thought about it," he said, addressing the CEO. "You're an adult now. You can make your own decisions. But your mother and I have our concerns." The CEO looked up at his parents, meeting their eyes without hesitation. His mother's gaze was sharp, calculating, while his father's was steady and resolute. "Tieu Lac and the baby will stay," the CEO said, his voice calm but unwavering. "This is not negotiable." His mother's lips pressed into a thin line at the words, but she didn't interrupt. She let the silence sit for a moment, her thoughts clearly racing behind her carefully composed face. The CEO continued, "I will take full responsibility. I want to move forward with them. Tieu Lac is the mother of my child, and that's what matters." For a brief moment, the room felt like it was holding its breath. His father leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers together as if pondering something deeper. His mother, however, remained silent, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Finally, his father spoke again. "We have no issue with the child," he said, "but we have to be sure about the future. We want to make sure that this arrangement is stable." It was not a question, not really. It was more like a subtle warning. The CEO met his father's eyes, then glanced at his mother. She had still said nothing. She hadn't agreed. But she hadn't outright disagreed either. The battle for control was only just beginning. "Stability isn't just about what's on paper," the CEO said. "It's about what we build together. I will make sure of it. No one will be left behind." At this, his mother finally spoke. "We are not questioning your ability to provide," she said coolly. "But what you need to understand is that family isn't just about a name. It's about legacy, about what comes next. Are you sure this is what you want? To risk everything for someone who isn't from the same background?" The word stung. The CEO knew she was referring to Tieu Lac. And in that moment, he realized just how deep the divide ran. It wasn't just about the baby. It was about the status, about the expectations placed on him as the heir to the family legacy, about his mother's expectations of who he should be with and who he should not. "I know what I'm doing," the CEO said, his voice hardening slightly. "I'm not risking anything. I'm choosing my family." The words felt like they had more weight than he intended. The room seemed to hold its breath again. His mother didn't respond immediately, but the tension in her body was palpable. He could feel her resistance growing. His father nodded slowly, his face thoughtful. "If this is what you want, then we will accept it. For now." The words hung in the air. The CEO rose from the table, but his mother's voice stopped him before he could leave the room. "If this is truly your decision, then there's something you must understand," she said, her voice calm but stern. "You cannot expect everything to stay the same. We will visit. We will see our grandchild. And you'll have to accept that." The CEO didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, acknowledging what his mother had said. The deal was made. But it wasn't a deal that came without strings attached. Tieu Lac waited in the apartment, her nerves running high. She had stayed behind while the CEO met with his parents, the baby cradled in her arms. She couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. How would his parents react? What was said in that room? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft cry from the baby. She gently rocked the child, trying to soothe her, but her mind was elsewhere. She had no idea how things would play out. Would his mother accept them? Or would this just be the beginning of a much bigger battle? As she looked out the window, she couldn't shake the feeling that the quiet tension wasn't over. Something was coming. She could feel it in her gut. When the CEO finally returned, Tieu Lac stood up. She could see the exhaustion in his face, the weight of everything that had happened. But there was also something else, something unreadable. He didn't speak immediately. He just walked toward her, taking the baby from her arms and holding her close. "We're moving forward," he said softly, his voice steady. "We've agreed to everything. I've told them that you and the baby are staying here." Tieu Lac's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know how to react. There was a strange mix of relief and anxiety settling in her chest. The decision had been made, but what did that mean for them? And what would his mother do next? "I'm not going to let anyone tear us apart," he added, as if reading her thoughts. "This is our family now, and nothing is going to change that." She nodded slowly, not sure if the reassurance was enough. Everything felt uncertain, even though they had taken a step forward. As night settled in, the apartment felt strangely quiet. The CEO had gone to bed early, exhausted from the conversation and the weight of his decision. Tieu Lac stayed up, rocking the baby, her thoughts spinning in circles. Would his mother truly accept them? Would she leave them alone, or was this just the beginning of something more? She didn't have the answers, but the feeling in her gut told her this wasn't over. And as the hours passed, Tieu Lac couldn't shake the nagging thought that the calm they had just found was fragile. Would they be allowed to live in peace, or would the forces that tried to tear them apart come back stronger than before? Tomorrow would tell. And for the first time, Tieu Lac wasn't sure if the future would bring peace or another battle. The next few days passed in a tense, uncertain quiet. Tieu Lac did her best to keep the routine calm, feeding the baby, settling into their new apartment, trying to find moments of peace amidst the uncertainty. The CEO remained by her side, but his attention was constantly divided. Every call he received, every message he read, seemed to pull him further away, back into the world he was trying to escape. His promises to her felt sincere, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She wasn't sure whether it was her anxiety or a lingering sense of foreboding. But she knew, deep down, that this peace wouldn't last. It didn't take long for the tension to rear its head again. The doorbell rang one morning. The CEO wasn't home, off handling work as usual. When Tieu Lac opened the door, she wasn't prepared for what she found. It was his mother, standing at the door with a calm, controlled expression. "Good morning," she said, her voice as polite as ever. "I thought I'd come by to visit my granddaughter." Tieu Lac stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. She had expected it. She had known it would come to this. But seeing his mother standing there, uninvited, unannounced, was a different matter entirely. "Of course," Tieu Lac said, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "Please, come in." She stepped aside, allowing his mother to enter. The two women didn't speak right away. The silence stretched, heavier than before. The CEO's mother glanced around the apartment, taking in the surroundings as if scrutinizing every detail. She walked over to the baby's crib, then turned to Tieu Lac. "She's growing," she commented, her tone softer now, but Tieu Lac could feel the underlying assessment. "You're doing a good job with her." The words weren't a compliment, not truly. They were just the beginning of something. Tieu Lac could feel it. His mother wasn't here to just visit. She was here to stake her claim. "I'm glad you came," Tieu Lac said after a long silence, attempting to break the tension. "But I thought this was supposed to be a private visit, just the family. The CEO's mother turned to her, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. It is a private visit, dear. But as you know, family isn't just about being here physically. It's about making sure everything is arranged for the future. The words were innocuous enough, but the weight behind them was impossible to ignore. She wasn't just here to visit her granddaughter. She was here to remind Tieu Lac of her place and to make sure she didn't forget it. As they sat down for tea, the conversation shifted. It wasn't about the baby anymore. It wasn't about small talk. It was about control. Things need to be in order, his mother said after a few moments, her voice lowering slightly. The baby needs to have a proper foundation. You've been living in this apartment for what? A few days now. Tieu Lac nodded, uncertain where this conversation was going. Yes. That's not enough, she replied calmly. The baby needs a stable home, a proper home. Tieu Lac's stomach tightened. She could already feel where this was heading. I've been thinking, his mother continued, as if everything she said was of utmost importance. Perhaps it's time for you to think about the future, a more secure future. Tieu Lac didn't speak immediately. She knew what was coming next. This wasn't a friendly visit. It wasn't a chance for them to bond over their shared love for the child. This was a calculation. The CEO's mother wasn't here to just meet her grandchild. She was here to remind Tieu Lac that she didn't belong in the world they had created. You need to think about what's best for the child, she added, her eyes narrowing slightly. And that means making sure she has a proper home, not just one that's temporary. Tieu Lac's chest tightened. This is our home, she said, her voice shaking slightly. This is where we'll raise her. His mother raised an eyebrow. You may think that now, she replied, but you don't see the bigger picture. There's more to stability than just a roof over your head. Tieu Lac's heart sank. She could feel the pressure building again. This wasn't about the baby anymore. It wasn't even about her. This was about something much bigger. The CEO's mother wasn't just trying to control their home. She was trying to control their future. Tieu Lac knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. His mother had come here today with a plan, and that plan wasn't just about checking in on her granddaughter. It was about making sure she had her hand on everything. She didn't want Tieu Lac to think she had any say. She wanted her to believe that she was only allowed to stay because the CEO allowed it. His mother was trying to create a distance between them, making sure that, in the end, Tieu Lac would always feel like an outsider. Later that evening, the CEO returned to the apartment. His eyes searched the room as he stepped inside, and for the first time, he noticed the tension in the air. Tieu Lac was sitting on the couch, the baby in her arms, her expression unreadable. His mother was nowhere to be seen. Tieu Lac, the CEO said softly. What happened? Tieu Lac didn't answer immediately. She looked up at him, her expression weary but determined. Your mother came to visit. She wants to make sure we don't get too comfortable here. The CEO exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. She's never going to let this go. Tieu Lac nodded, her voice soft but firm. I know, but we'll figure it out. For a moment, there was silence between them. The baby shifted slightly in Tieu Lac's arms, a soft, contented sigh escaping her lips. The CEO walked over and sat beside her. He took a deep breath, his fingers brushing hers. We'll figure it out, he repeated, as if to convince himself as much as her. But deep down, Tieu Lac couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The mother would always be a presence, a force that couldn't be ignored. The real question was, how long could they keep fighting it? Would this life they had started build a future, or would it eventually crumble under the weight of control? In today's episode, the CEO is forced to confront the tension between his love for Tieu Lac and the controlling influence of his mother. After an emotional family meeting, the CEO agrees to let his mother visit their grandchild, but Tieu Lac starts to feel the weight of her mother-in-law's control. As she waits anxiously at home, the CEO returns to assure her that they are moving forward together. However, his mother's subtle manipulation continues, leaving Tieu Lac to question whether their future is truly in their hands. As the family dynamics shift, the CEO must decide if he can protect his new family or if he will be pulled back into his mother's control. Will Tieu Lac and the CEO's relationship survive the pressure?